Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Humanities Tennessee, welcome to the Southern Festival of Books. If you are watching on Facebook Live or YouTube and want to ask questions during the session, please feel free to do so. If you post them to the chat or to the question and answer link, a staff person will make sure I can see them and share them with our guest. I want to remind you that the festival is a free, nonprofit event that is supported in part by donations from individuals. If you appreciate the event and want to support it, you can do so in the app or by visiting our website. It's at www.humtn.org. Parnassus is our bookseller, and your purchase of the book Late City through Parnassus will keep the festival free since they donate a portion of those sales to the festival. Humanities Tennessee staff will place the book buy link in for our session in the top of the chat, and you can use that link to purchase the book. So now on to our discussion. Robert Olen Butler is a prize-winning author of 24 previous novels and short story collections, including A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, for which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1993. The New York Times praised the book's startling, dreamlike stories about the lives of Vietnamese immigrants living in Louisiana, and said it was remarkable not for its flaws, but for how beautifully it achieves its daring project of making the Vietnamese real. In 2001, he won a National Magazine Award for Fair Warning, a short story that was published in the journal Zoetrope. And 4 years later, he won another National Magazine Award for The One in White, a short story published in the Atlantic Monthly. Robert is also the author of a book on the creative writing process, From Where You Dream. And in 2013, he received the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for Outstanding Achievement in American Literature. He currently teaches creative writing at Florida State University, and I am so happy to welcome you to the Southern Festival of Books.
Good to be here, Lynn. Great to see you.
I'm always interested in what other people are reading, and in particular, what other authors are reading. What are you currently reading?
Actually, I've been doing some golden oldies lately. Since I am 30,000 words into the next novel, I tend to not read a lot of other fiction just to because I need to keep fully in touch with my own voice. But some of the golden oldies certainly pull me back. And so what I've been reading lately was The Great Gatsby. I revisited The Great Gatsby and was newly enchanted with that.
I reread a lot, so I can understand that. And when you're talking about immersing yourself in a book, I've one thing that I really enjoyed about Late City was the way I was immersed in the life of the protagonist, Sam. Now, your approach is unusual. You have a 115-year-old newsman who's in bed dying and having a conversation with God.
Yes. And the latter, because he, in point of fact, he has just begun to die. It's not just, it's not easy. He's not in on the long sliding slope. 10 minutes, it's 2016, and 10 minutes after the election of that guy, Sam Cunningham begins to die. Of the 80,000 words in that book, probably 72,000 of them take place in a nanosecond. It is time stops. God arrives and says, Sam, it's time to do this. which, by the way, is why the title is relevant. Late City is actually a reference to what all the great daily newspapers used to call the late city edition. Before the internet and so forth, when everything we knew about the world in an ongoing way that we get every second of the day is updated on the internet. But it used to be, they came out in these big old newspapers, and we had the morning edition, the afternoon edition, the Bulldog edition, whatever. The late city edition, for a number of the biggest newspapers, that late city edition was the very last edition. I mean, quite late. Some of them as late as 2 a.m. of the following day. But
Wow.
even in spite of that, 2 a.m, it was, and that's the point, it was the last edition that bore the dateline of that previous day. And it was the final word of what everything that has happened that previous day, which is in essence a trope for Sam lying there in bed telling his own story. In fact, he and God kind of agree to call it the Sam Cunningham Inquirer is the name of this newspaper, the Cunningham Inquirer. And that's, so that's really what's happening there. And God appears in that interim of time between the passage from life to whatever might be next.
Yes. And, as Sam recalls his life and recalls his time as a boy, as a soldier, husband, father, we get his relationships, but we also get a sense of something driving him. And you once said that writing fiction was your ultimate destiny. And destiny seems to play a large role in this novel. Could you share with us what destiny means to you?
Yeah. And I that's interesting you cited that, because that was some long time ago when I must have said that, and I buy into it. I think in this is not to change my opinion about that, because I think the destiny part is the way you might look back and say, well, that was my destiny.
Mhm.
The getting to it is people say they know their destiny, or they say they can see their destiny and they're pursuing it. In point of fact, that's not really the way the human condition operates. But the thing that drives them toward their destiny, and at the heart of what they might conclude is their destiny at the back end, where Sam is, has to do with something that I think is at the core of all literary fiction, all narrative that has is of the literary genre. In other words, its focus is on not the surface goals and objectives of characters, which is how Aristotle defines narrative, that they have those goals and objectives that are challenged. That's true. But there are a lot of genres of fiction that allow them to linger delightfully or fascinate with great fascination upon the level of, my goal, my objective is that woman or that man, or to solve that crime, or save planet Earth from alien invasion, or whatever it is, and but for the literary novel, I use with my students another term, which is yearning, which suggests the deepest level of goal and objective. And I've also come to think that if you dig down that deep, I've got a kind of what Einstein called about his ideas about what the world is all, how it works. I have a unified field theory of yearning for literary fiction. And we're getting around to destiny, don't worry. And because it seems to me that literary fiction, the central character, or maybe even the other characters too, but certainly the central character, that character's yearning is for a self, for an identity, for a place in the universe. And why is that? Because that's what life is all about, that we are always, every moment of our lives, to the moment when we say, well, that was our destiny, because our destiny is to be who we are. The great question always before us is, who the hell am I? And it's the pursuit of that is what is at the heart of literary fiction. And if you think about it, all the flashpoints in our life, in history, and in our culture, race and gender and politics and nationality and religion and the number of other categories, but those flashpoints, if you step back from them, what are they actually? They are prefabricated answers to that question. Every one of those things says, here's the answer to the question of who you are. I'm white, I'm black, I'm male, I'm female, I'm bi, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm American, I'm Christian, Muslim, I'm Jewish, and those things may well be an important part of one's ultimate self, but when they're offered in those ways and too often taken on in those ways by people, they are there in the prefabricated way that, okay, that's it. I don't have to, I've answered that question, and you cling to that, and you force those who you recognize as your own, they would have to be within the boundaries of that. Okay. And the literary writer says, it's way more complicated than that. And that's what we are all writing books about.
Sam's life is definitely complicated.
Indeed. And more than he has to come to realize how complicated it was, and in what ways he needed to embrace an identity as a result of that. There's some major revelations in this book.
Which kind of brings me to my next question. There were a few things, especially towards the end, that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Mm. Do you know the ending of a story before you write it?
I do not. No, those things, and I trust that you weren't expecting them, but once they happened, you went, yes, I feel that how that was earned. And for me to prefabricate the ending of my book is just as false as the prefabrication of myself in the way I was talking about earlier. So that, the book, the character, that yearning takes me where it needs to go. Now, where that comes from is the great roiling white hot center of my imagination, which is composed of, you and I were talking earlier about Graham Greene before we came on the air here, and he once said that all good novelists have bad memories. Yes. He says what you remember comes out as journalism. What you forget goes into the compost of the imagination. And then I was apologizing for my bad memory that you might run into in this conversation. Wow. But let's look at the back end of that statement now, because that's the thing. It is this great welter of a compost heap. And I'm not quite as old as Sam. I'm 76, but I've been a lot of places and done a lot of things and known a lot of people in lots of different ways. And they have all gone into that place. The characters who come out of there, as Sam Cunningham has, my job then is to inhabit him as I write. And though what he knows of, what he will discover about the human condition is the latent knowledge that I hope to find in myself by writing the book.
I find that really interesting because one of the things that struck me was here was a man who was 115 who fought as a sniper in World War I, who is living, well, he's dying in 2016, but through the flashbacks, we get bits and pieces of his life between the wars, dealing with sorrow and loss in World War II, dealing with Jim Crow and some of the other social issues of his time. And you have extraordinary detail. You really look at his reactions and give a very personal feel to this, but yet they are things that, at least as he's experiencing them, they have to be outside of your experience. And I was impressed with how authentic it all felt.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a complex thing. I could not have written this for a lot of reasons, but even in terms of a narrower inhabiting of a narrower range of experience, or a closer, even a contemporary range of experience that really I've not personally been part of. Here I couldn't have been in terms of the historical things. But even, I've always I'm always having to kind of rein in my students a little bit about that. They like to leave, seems to them, be a much larger, a more interesting frame of reference than their own lives so far. But as soon as they do that, they leap outside of their own innate authenticity. And instead of writing from their deep unconscious, from their own white hot center, they are willing things into existence. They are thinking the details into the work. You have to be a master of your own unconscious before you are able to project that into characters who live in a different way, or a different gender, or a different historic time period. But the gift that a literary writer has in going deep in and never averting your eyes, and of never flinching, and facing down all that is roiling in you in that white hot center of you. If you keep doing that and doing that, your capacity to feel into other characters who on the surface might be quite different from you, that capacity gets stronger. And then it's a matter of knowing how to go get those details that make that are indeed authentic, down to the is there a light switch in 1919 in a duplex house in a suburb of Chicago? What is the newsroom? How do they get their copy from here to there in the newsroom in the Chicago newspaper? All that's, just as a couple of examples. And so, but then, and the other thing is, I don't think I could have written this novel. It would have been overwhelming. Well, you can look behind me. This is part of my reference section. This is the desk where I write my books, and those are, you only see a few of the shelves. This is just part of the reference section, where I used to have to go to try to answer those moment-to-moment, sense detail, novelistic, cinematic questions. You have to answer those things, how those things look and tasted and smelled and felt. I hardly pull. There are 3 or 4 volumes behind me that I look at now and then, but that's about it. And we laugh at this institution. We sneer at it, some of us at times, but I could not have written this book, certainly not as effectively, if it weren't for the internet and a skill I had to acquire, just as I acquired the skill of knowing what books might tell me what. And I've got bound volumes of, from library sales of all the Scribner's magazine, 21 to 1958, for example, and knowing how to go through there and looking at the ads even, and looking at, how to pull out the details of life from those. You have to reacquire that skill. And I'm really good at finding stuff on the internet now. And that's how you do it. But the trick is that when I do and it's even easier on the internet in a way, because I don't have the book, how getting to the page that might help you is an activity that has nothing to do with the process that you're going to be putting on the page. But you can get relatively quickly to places that you need to go on the internet. And so I am able, when I'm looking at the raw material of everyday life, from which I will draw the moment-to-moment experience of the character that I'm working with, I actually go to the internet and to those materials in character. By the way, my early training was as an actor. I went to Northwestern University, great theater school, as an actor. And you learn the method acting, which is you really make the internal mechanism of the character your own. Well, I do that with the characters I write. I inhabit the character, or they let the character inhabit me. And so I do the research for those kind of things you're talking about in character through the sensibility, the inhabited sensibility of the character who I'm writing. And so that's the way I'm able to pull all that stuff together.
I also know that you have a master's degree basically in playwriting.
Yes.
And I wondered after I'd finished the book, if maybe your sense of how to put together a script added to that sense of immediacy and drama that is very much a part of this book. I didn't think so much about the acting, but I did wonder about the time with playwriting.
Yeah, the playwriting, and then later on, I was wooed at times by Hollywood, and I've always and I've understood movies and the kind of 3-act structure of screenplays, which was a kind of outgrowth of my working quite directly with the inevitable constraints and therefore opportunities of structuring a play. And so yes, those things have that compost heap I was talking about. It's all about life experience, but it's also about, in fact, I do often tell my students that when I'm critiquing their manuscript in class and I get down into technical matters, my reminder to them always is, now after this semester is over, I want you to forget everything I have said to you. All the craft and technique that a writer learns, that writer does not have command of those techniques until they have forgotten them. Until what you understand in a structural, analytical way, until those techniques, which are enter into you that with that kind of consciousness, until you have allowed yourself to take in the wisdom of that lies behind that is the observation that has been structured into a summarizing sort of declaration of technique, that has to then be put straight down into and forgotten into the same compost wherein resides what will be the raw material of that technique will allow you to have dynamic access to in the creation of a narrative.
Wow. I want to take just a moment and remind people that if they have questions they would like to ask, they can put them in the chat and they'll be forwarded on to me. Right now, we don't have any questions, and so I get to continue asking my questions, but I don't want to inhibit anybody from asking questions. So I just want to remind everybody that you can ask questions and they will be passed on, and I'll make sure that Robert has a chance to answer them. You wrote a book on the creative process from where you dream, and you teach creative writing, and you've talked a lot about what you talk to people about in terms of writing. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your process with us? How do you make, when you're getting started and you're having to move from who you are to, I'm going to go back to Sam and the 115-year-old man who is dying. How do you get started? How do you make that leap?
Well, the getting started and making the leap
are two different things.
Are a kind of two different things. The leap has to do with, man, there's enough going on in me now that I think this is there's a book going on here. But even at that point, the way that shapes up is not unlike what happens at the leap part, that obviously a character begins to emerge, and I suppose and there have to be external things in my life and in the world, and I may not even be aware of them, that begin to start to breathe life into that character who would be at the center of a novel. Let's say, I've told stories too, but it's just kind of a condensed version of that. And look, the book starts 10 minutes after the 2016 election has been declared. And that and the subsequent effects of that on this country and a sense of who we all are and how many of us there are that see a certain thing in a strong way in this direction, and the shockingly large number that sees it in this other direction, and what a large number, even after 4 years of that, how big that number is. And I'm putting no value judgments on that, just to say that, because for one thing, wonderful book reviewer who's always understood me really well, Chauncey May, who used to be in the Sun Sentinel in Florida. always remarked about one of his favorite books of mine is Hell. A book set in hell, and the devil himself is a complex character in the book, and all his little demons, as bad as they are, there is something there that I am driven to understand. And so when I say, look, these two halves of this country, or the 57% of the country and 43, I'm not, I don't mean, my deepest instinct is to never demonize, and I'm not going to, but the uproar of all of that and the collision of drastically different sentience about this country and the world, that needless to say, it's not just an arbitrary point, a starting point for the book. It was in terms of the writing of the book, it was, I know that was a major beginning of the conception of this book, because I lived through a lot of, I was born in 1945, and I lived through a lot of different versions of this country, and I ended up not willingly, but I ended up going to a war that profoundly shaped this country, and watched others. My father, who I was very close to, he was an infantry captain in the World War, and by way of him, and 1,000 deep into the night conversations with him, he made that experience part of me as well. I've been through a lot. Been married 5 times, so and I feel tenderly about all of those, and so there's a lot. And once we reached a kind of kind of turning point in November of 2016, this book, it pulled together the American century, what's called the American century for me, much of which I experienced. And
it was fascinating to read the progression through the century, and I'm struck too by what you said about the election. I mean, obviously, it was a marking point within the novel. If nothing else, we were reminded that this passage of time that seems to be happening in the novel isn't happening in real time, because the reader is periodically reminded that the TV's on and the election has just happened.
Right.
And yet, listening to you, I'm struck by the parallels between what's happening in Sam's life and what's happening in our country, not necessarily at the election, but in the years that subsequently follow. And I think it becomes a touchstone in a way that I was only somewhat aware of along the way. And I find that really, it makes me want to go back and look at some parts again.
Yeah, and for example, the two major, as we follow his journalistic career, the two major the two stories that he followed as a reporter most closely, I mean, the implication is he did many others this closely,
Yes.
but the two that come back to him in his memory are Al Capone and Huey Long.
Yes.
And I would contend, and this is going to sound like demonizing, it's not, it's just, it's just owning up to the realities, that if you took 70 IQ points away from each of those guys and then combined their worst qualities. Do I need to finish that sentence?
No,
although, but there it is. It does, but no. What I'm saying, it does, and that kind of snarky about politically fraught way of saying something that has a deeper aesthetic purpose. Yeah, those two men, in their own ways, represented qualities that have always been and always will be part of the American character.
Right. With Huey Long, one of the things you have with him is the progressive movement.
Yeah.
And that's so much a part of our politics now.
Yeah. And with Al Capone, we see a side of him that is not, he is a rounded character.
That's one of the things that really struck me about the portrayal of Al Capone was that you never ignore the fact that the mob is right there and is very much a part of what he does.
Yeah.
But he's humanized beyond that. And that makes him a much richer character. And it makes his friendship with Sam, well, I'll call it friendship. It's
his connection, that rapport, that odd rapport between them. Yeah.
It makes it much more complex.
Yes.
And it enriches Sam's character that he seems to recognize it. And it makes us trust his sense of character in a way that some of his other judgments then are a little bit more surprising. And it gets back to the idea that it's sometimes hard to read people that you're close to.
Yep. That's true. That is an underlying thread of human experience in this book. You bet. Absolutely. And it's hard but it's even hard to read ourselves as well.
Actually, I don't know that we can read ourselves.
No. And
that's one of the things that I think Sam comes to realize at the very, very end.
Yes, absolutely.
And but his journey, as I said, at times, if you didn't come back to things that are going on around him, either on the television or down the hall at the nurse's station, you would lose sight of the fact that what he's recounting are memories, that time is essentially standing still.
Yes.
While he is dying. It can get tricky I know you've written hell, but it gets tricky to bring in God as a character.
Oh yeah. No, I know. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
So I'm interested in how you make that kind of decision. How careful do you have to be as you're crafting it? How much how nervous does your agent get as you're putting together the book?
Of all the reaction to the book publicly, we've only had one sort of glaring dissenter about that, and I think revealed more about himself than he did about the book. And because there's nothing sentimental about this God. There is nothing, there is nothing. This God has is a bit of a dirty mouth at times, and he's got a sense of humor. And what he does is he feels very comfortable in his own. It's my unified field theory at work again, too. In a way, he's expressing a self that is not the self that the prefabricated structures that put him at the center have attributed to him exclusively. He is a different critter from the one that he's known to be among those institutions that offer an identity based on an assumption of what he is or they are. Yeah. And
yes.
And so again, it wasn't a strategic thing. They appeared on their own. God did, and they were who they were. And as you know, the book, even that question is a complex one in this book, and one of the important ways in which this book comes to, and Sam comes to, a fuller understanding of what the human condition is.
Yes.
And none of that was known to me, where it would end up in that way, until deep into the book. And even then I did not know how it would manifest itself exactly.
That's very interesting, considering how central some of these issues become towards the end of the novel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid, as much as I have enjoyed this, we are out of time.
No. I was just about to tell you about we have gotten into religion just at the moment when we have to go away. I was going to tell you about how the guy at the centerpiece of one of the great religions, all he ever did, and the books most closely written about it, was he told stories. You want to understand the kingdom of heaven, the most important things in the world, then he could find the answer to that in a mustard seed. And so that's what literary writers do.
Yes, and you do it very well.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for talking to me, because it has been a wonderful conversation. And I want to thank everybody for attending this session of the Southern Festival of Books. I want to remind them that the book purchase link for the session is in the chat, and that the festival continues this afternoon and tomorrow from noon until 5. And many of these sessions will be available on YouTube and on the Southern Festival of Book Facebook page, so that if you miss a session that you want to hear, you can go back and watch it later. So again, thank you very much, Robert, for talking with us about your book.
It's been my pleasure, Lynn.
I recommend it to people. It is a wonderful read. I sat down and had trouble putting it down and stopping.
Right. Thank you. It's been a delight to see you again, and delight to talk to you, Lynn. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody at the Southern Festival, they all know how much I love them. I've been with you folks many times.
Thank you.